Hello, I'm Nina Ellis from public radio station WYSO in Yellow Springs, Ohio, here with my colleague Chris Welter for episode 3.
This episode is called The Shawnee Life on the Land. We're going to take a look at what Shawnee people did at different times of the year to sustain their communities here in Ohio.
When Southwest Ohio was their home, the Shawnee had a really sophisticated and collaborative relationship with the land, and we'll hear from them about that. So thanks for staying with us. It's a cold March morning, just above freezing. An outdoor fire feels really good. A young woman and man keep it burning and stir a 10-gallon kettle of maple sap as steam billows up.
We started with about 10-ish gallons this morning of sap. And so what we are doing is now we're just putting on top of heat and keeping it boiling until all of that water is evaporated. And so that's what all this stuff coming out of the pot is. It's just the water.
This is Shawnee Silverhorn. She and her partner Talon Silverhorn are wearing moccasins, leggings, and white linen shirts, traditional Native American clothing for the early 1800s. They first met as historic interpreters at Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. Talon does this work for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and also on the side, he's in demand. He and Shelley are here today, invited by the Western Reserve Historical Society to show visitors to Hale Farm and Village near Akron how the Shawnee people have traditionally made maple sugar. Visitors to Hale Farm are used to seeing demonstrations of blacksmithing, spinning, weaving, and candle making, the skills of white settlers who came here in the 1800s. But Shelley and Talon are part of a new effort by Hale Farm to invite citizens of federally recognized tribes to tell their own story, acknowledging that these public programs need to be more inclusive.
How are y'all doing today?
Good.
Good. So, my name's Talon, this is Shelley.
A steady stream of visitors ask a lot of questions. Shelley and Talon repeat their story over and over.
Shawnee traditions of maple sugaring. So this is something that's been done for a very, very long time. We know that sugaring and salt reduction has been done for probably close to about 700 years or so here in this part of the country. So this is exactly what you would have seen people in the 18th century, early 19th century using, and we're producing these hard sugar cakes. So we take this sap, boil it into syrup, and then reduce that until there's no longer any steam coming off of it, which means there's no longer any water in it. And then we pour the hot sugar into these molds here. And those molds will produce these bricks of hard sugar that we can keep throughout the year. And so what you're looking at here in the trough and in the bowl is probably just under what a family will eat in sugar a year. So that's our entire year's worth of sugar for our family right there.
He's pointing at what amounts to a pound of sugar per person per year. Today, the average American eats 57 pounds of added sugar in a year. Talon meets with the public so often, and talking about Shawnee traditions are such a part of who he is, that he comfortably speaks as if this is the early 1800s.
Yeah. So the sugaring season, no matter the time period, is from your first warm day of winter, the end of winter, and your last cold night at the beginning of spring. So it's about a 3 to 4 week period that you have. So that becomes our sugaring season, right? So our home away from home, when this time of year hits, we build these temporary homes out away from our villages in the sugar bush where we know these trees are. And we just live out there and tap and boil and pour and make sugar. We make our entire year's worth of sugar in one season, one 3 to 4 week period essentially. We'll produce our entire year's worth of sugar. Do y'all have any questions, or is there anything you want to know about, or you want to come look at
The fire burns all day. Now and then, visitors hold their kids up so they can see the sap boiling in the kettle. Talon Silverhorn took an interest in his tribe's traditions when he was a child, and everything he learned in Oklahoma was knowledge passed down from Shawnee ancestors in the Ohio country before they were removed.
The Ohio Country is the name of our series about the historic tribes of Ohio. At least 7 tribes lived here when Ohio became a state. The Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Ottawa, Seneca, Cayuga, and Lenape, also known as the Delaware. In less than 50 years after statehood, all the tribes had been forcibly removed. But the tribes were resilient, and they survive today because they've maintained and revitalized their languages and cultures. The Shawnee lived all over southern Ohio before white settlers arrived. They were farming, trading, hunting, but as the whites expanded their settlements, the Shawnee were pushed out. Talon Silverhorn belongs to a large and well-documented Eastern Shawnee family named Blue Jacket, descended from the famous Shawnee chief who fought long and hard against that white settlement and expansion.
So I think the best place to start with telling my story, the connection to this place, would be an introduction of myself. So in Sawanwak Tuwewe, the Shawnee language, I would tell you, Hato, Haki Hawasila Simamo, Nehawasila Simamo Kwakila, Ila Sawamo Yila Wakwaki, Park Simonki, Yitakotaki, Mala Mayama, Oklahoma, to Wyandotte, Oklahoma. The Kakila and Nomsa Hole Wanaka Nitasito, Nikia Carrie Silverhorn, Tinotha Clint Silverhorn, the Kokochi, Teresa Peacock Blue Jacket, the Soma Lance Silverhorn. So I told you what tribe I was from, what country I was from. I told you where within that country I was born, what clan I am. I told you my own name, and then I told you my mother and her mother, my father and his father. And so all of that kind of put together gives you a complete picture of my own identity. For Sawanoki, for Shawnee people as a whole, our identity is very deeply tied to our connection to the land.
Talon took an interest in Shawnee traditions as a child. At 16, he started working for the Historic Preservation Office of his tribe, and after high school, he went to work at Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia as a cultural interpreter. And that's what he does now, as an employee of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. He works with state officials and at public events where you might meet him demonstrating Shawnee traditions, like maple sugaring or maybe flint knapping. He also knows how to make horn spoons, musical instruments, moccasins, arrows, and bows.
I grew up hunting. I grew up outdoors most of the time. Hunting, fishing, trapping, just generally interacting with the environment and learning how to do so responsibly. My uncle was the one who taught me most of that, took me shooting, whether bows or, his guns or what have you. But he taught me how to make bows. I got my first bow when I was pretty young, and I had a couple of them, apparently, that broke until I was about 5 years old. And, I asked my uncle for a new one, and, he said no. He said that I was old enough to make one for myself, and that, if I wanted a new bow, I was going to have to do it. That he would show me how, but I would be the one making this bow. So we sat down, and he pulled out a small piece of hickory. He had a white 5-gallon bucket that kind of stood in the corner. And he took this piece of hickory with the bark still on it, and he drew a line right in the middle. So he measured it out, and on one side, he took, and he would do one thing. So he would take the bark off one side, and then he would hand it to me, and he expected me to take the bark off the other side. And then he would draw a profile line. And our bows are pretty straight. They're very, very long sort of rectangles. They don't narrow very much at all. But he would take and draw those lines, and he would kind of whittle down with his knife, and then he would turn it around, and I would have to copy exactly what he was doing. And then, he started on the process of scraping that bow down and getting it to bend right. And then he showed me how to twist the string. Then he made a couple of arrows. So we made some practice arrows, and then we made some real arrows. And the goal was that if I got this bow done, that winter, we would go out and we would hunt for rabbits. But I would have to practice, and I would have to show him that I was a good enough shot to go out and do that. So there was this ditch that sat right by the house, and There were tires and coffee lids and all kinds of other things kind of scattered over there. And those were our targets. We would test our skills and sharpen up, by shooting at that. So eventually it came time. It started to snow, and we got about 3 snows in, and it was time to go hunt. So we set out kind of early in the morning, and the snow had just stopped. I remember that. And it was just quiet. And we were walking along, and he was telling me that it's very easy to track in the snow, especially just after it's done snowing, because that's usually when things will get up and shake off and walk around and move around a little bit. And that fresh snow, it's very easy to follow them. So we were looking for rabbits in particular. And we eventually found a little rabbit trail, which they're pretty erratic. They kind of go everywhere. They don't really follow much of a set path except for where they're coming in and where they're coming out of their place. So we found this rabbit, and it's just a little brown, kind of common rabbit. And the reason that he wanted to take me hunting for rabbits was because, unlike a lot of other things, you can usually get more than one shot if you miss on a rabbit, because their habit is to freeze. They don't want to be seen. They want to remain hidden. And if they look enough like a stump or a rock, you might just leave them alone. So, I was able to sneak up pretty close, or get pretty close. This rabbit sitting there with its ears up in the air, pointed at me, its eyes wide open. And I took my first shot, and I missed. And its ears went down, and its neck kind of shrunk, and it kind of hunkered down in the snow. And I pulled back, and I took my second shot, and that shot missed. And it kind of hopped a little bit then. It kind of, took off. But it didn't go very far. And my third shot, I ended up hitting it, but it was too far back, and it wasn't a good shot. But luckily, of course, my uncle had his bow with him, and he took his own shot, and we just counted it as mine. So we brought it back to the house, and alongside dinner with everything else that we were having, we cooked that rabbit, and everybody got a piece of that rabbit. So that was the first meal that I provided for the family.
This here is a small raised bed that I use to grow. This is tobacco. So this is a traditional type tobacco that was grown by the Shawnee and Wyandotte, Seneca Cayugas. And this type of tobacco is Nicotana rustica, the genus name is. We would use it basically for ceremonial purposes. It's smoked for ceremonial purposes.
This is Jeremy Turner. Like Talon, he can trace his families back to the Ohio country. He's an enrolled citizen of the Shawnee Tribe, and he's descended from Shawnee, Seneca Cayuga, and Wyandotte nations. He grew up in Indianapolis, where he's a lieutenant on Engine 82 of the Wayne Township Fire Department. Jeremy spent years researching Shawnee traditions, learning the language of the land that his forebears knew so well. He's especially knowledgeable about farming and seed saving. His tribal and family traditions are reliant on plants, and he wants to preserve that knowledge and share it.
Gardening and farming in a historical sense, prior to contact and up until the early 1800s, when the American government tried to really change this system, the gardening itself was women's work. They're the ones that planted the fields, they're the ones that tended the crops, and they're the ones that harvested them.
Turner farms 14 acres intensively, much of it the way his ancestors did. Among his many crops are what are known as the Three Sisters.
The location of the fields were always along rivers. That is the natural area that floods. So when the water raises in the spring floods, what it does is it deposits soil that is really high in nutrients, along these riverbanks and stuff. And so those were the most fertile areas to begin with. And so we took advantage of that. And we located our fields along those riverbanks because of the floods. Those fields were more like modern-day community gardens. Extended families through the women's lines, like grandmother, daughters, granddaughters, their areas of the garden would be near each other. So you would have extended families in different areas of the garden. Because some of these fields were, a couple of miles in size, wide and length, and they would basically use the hand tools that they made out of, a lot of archaeological evidence shows like buffalo scapula, antler tines being used for rakes and stuff like that. And then eventually with Europeans that came, then the metal tools, metal hoes and that kind of stuff were used, obviously. The actual technique of the farming was to hill up a portion of earth. And so in that hill, that's where corn was planted in the center. And then once it got to a certain height, then the beans were planted around the corn because the beans would grow up the corn stalk. Corn takes nitrogen from the soil, and beans actually replenish nitrogen into the soil. So that's a part of that pairing, that sister aspect of it. What one is taking from the soil, the other is putting back in the soil. And so that was another reason why they were planted together, to help keep the soil fertile as well. And then after those two crops had got a good start, that's when the squash were planted around the bases of the hills so that they would grow out and vine out in between the hills, and all of the leaves. Squash leaves are very big and they provide a lot of shade. And so that would shade out the areas to keep grass and weeds from growing in between. Grass grows on poor soil. Weeds especially grow on poor soil. And so the more fertile the soil was, the less likely it was to have weeds anyway. And so by planting those squash, it really helped to shade out what small amount of weeds there were. And so the women would basically spend each morning, during the summer as their crops are growing, they would go down to their gardens and little work parties and spend a little bit of time in the morning in their gardens working in them, weeding. Then they would come back to their homes and prepare meals, work on projects, that kind of thing. The men a lot of times would be the ones that were cutting down the trees, along the rivers to produce the fields and the open areas so the sunlight could get to the gardens. So they were the ones cutting the trees, and prior to contact, they would use a technique called burning. They would ring the tree with fire and basically kill it, but leave it standing so that it wouldn't grow foliage and allow the sunlight to come through. They could harvest the bark off of it if they were going to use that for their homes or canoes, but a lot of times they left those trees standing. An interesting aspect of that is that young boys, their job would be to go around with their bows and basically shoot any varmints that were raiding those crops, any birds. That's how they were learning to hunt, was by protecting their family's cornfields in that way. So there would be little groups of adolescent boys running around these cornfields, shooting any of these pest-type animals, raccoons, squirrels, and stuff, and they would bring them back to their mothers and sisters to cook. That was their contribution to the family.
Jeremy Turner has taught all this to his children, and he travels all over the Midwest on weekends, going to public programs.
So, can everybody hear me that's here now? All right.
Today he's giving a tour near Springfield, Ohio, at what's now called George Rogers Clark Park, where a large Shawnee village called Piqua, or Pickaway, once stood. There's been an attempt to create Shawnee-style homes and council houses for the annual fair at New Boston.
So this is the center of this town, Piqua town, right? This hilltop we're on is the most likely site, in my opinion, where that council house stood. along the river, all along here, down in this valley, even where the cornfields are today, were cornfields in this town in 1768, which is the earliest record we have of this town. That's exactly where the cornfields were. And it makes sense because that's the natural alluvial soil that is constantly pushed up from the riverbanks. It continuously replenishes the soil to make sure that the crops do well. A lot of times, towns would only stay in an area as long as their cornfields were producing. I've read some documents from the Moravians that said so we think of our gardens today and we're constantly battling weeds, grass, and that's because our gardens are not super fertile, right? And that's the best thing that grows in these unfertile grounds, right? So in the 18th century and prior to that, and that's what the Moravians said, as soon as Indians start fighting grass in their cornfields, they move. It's not worth the fight. That soil is depleted. It needs time to reheal. So they move their towns, okay? And so on the most towns only have a lifespan of, 10 to 20 years before they're moved because of that. So anyway, this town was here from 1768 till it was destroyed in 1780 by George Rogers Clark and the raid.
George Rogers Clark, an American general, brought 1,000 troops here, and in a one-day military operation, the Shawnee were overwhelmed and escaped to the north. Clark instructed his troops to burn all the homes and buildings, and the farm fields too.
It bugs me to have this place, which was one of our towns, our heartbeats, and think of the families that live here, the kids that were raised here, the things that happened in that council house for 12 years. To have one day in history name this area, for the people that burnt this town to the ground. It infuriates me. It absolutely infuriates me that it is named George Rogers Clark Park. So I hope one day the citizens of Ohio will be as infuriated as I am, and we can do something about that. So for me, I want to think of the families that were here and the good times, the laughter that was here, That's what I want to think of.
Despite the bloody history, Jeremy Turner often mentions that the indigenous people who lived in the Ohio River Valley and the settlers weren't always fighting. They shared skills and technology, he says. There was respect and intermarriage. And he wants to see a future built on collaboration with the tribes, not recriminations.
I would love to see, in something that Talon and I have talked about, is trying to garner interest in our communities, to get them interested in coming back to our homelands, And with that, we become more visible, we become more relevant, we become, neighbors to, everyone else, and we interact on a daily basis with them, and we're no longer exotic and a thing of the past. We're relevant and here today. And along with that, I hope to see, those families interested in exactly what I'm talking about, is, growing our old varieties of food, hunting, trapping, fishing, because Shawnees and other tribal citizens who signed treaties, there are certain treaties that were signed with the American government that pertain to Ohio, Indiana, those lands, that were never abrogated. And we still retain hunting, fishing, and trapping rights in those states that we need to exercise. And so with more of our folks coming back to those states, my hope is that it will push that into the future, and we will, again, assert those rights, and we will begin living close to the environment, because it's good for our Mother Earth, living in unison with it and cohabitating in a way that does not destroy the earth and harm it any further than has already been done is the way of the future. That's the only way that we will, be able to be here in another 1,000 years. Otherwise, the way that we're living today is very destructive. And, if we keep it up, we may not last 1,000 years, and this earth may be destroyed by then. So, I really want to see our families come back here, live in a way again that, we can honor our past, but still carry on in the future sense, and continue to grow and prosper, and bring a lot of these things back that I'm interested in.
Jeremy Turner and Talon Silverhorn are both all about living close to the environment. When Talon spoke at the annual Botanical Symposium held by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in 2023, he described how the Shawnee and their ancestors who lived in Ohio from time immemorial helped ecosystems thrive with careful stewardship intended to keep the land healthy and productive forever. His people and the land evolved together, he says, co-created and codependent. And because of that, the Ohio country defines the Shawnee culture. Their foods, medicines, language, and ceremonies, all of it comes from here. For Talon, living and working in Ohio can be frustrating because so few people know the true Shawnee history, but on other days, it's downright thrilling.
It's very hard to practice parts of Shawnee culture in Oklahoma because we're not dealing with the same resources and the same environment that we were here for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The water is just not the same, right? We don't have the same types of horsetail or the same types of sandstone or the things. I remember the first time I went down to Shawnee State Park. Within the first, I think, 6 months that I arrived here in Ohio, it was like cultural vibrancy got turned up to like 11 because I saw every single thing. It was like I was on a checklist. I saw every single thing that I know from certain stories or medicines or uses that we have that I would never be able to find in Oklahoma. But it was all there. It was like I could have just hopped out of the car, let it roll down the road, and I could have lived right there, probably on somebody's property. But I would have had everything that I know traditionally there available to me in one place, which is just astounding.
Talon urges the conference goers to reach out to tribal people and work with them toward a healthier future for the land. And this drone flute you're hearing, that's Talon too, playing a traditional instrument he made himself. In the next episode of The Ohio Country, what the land in southwest Ohio was like when the settlers arrived. It was not a wilderness, as we are often told.
This was not a wilderness. We were active within the landscape. We used fire to burn back in the fall. We used beavers to control the environment around us. All those things need to be put back in place, in my opinion. And used to help the plants that are native to reestablish themselves.
This was episode 3 of The Ohio Country called The Shawnee Life on the Land. It was written by Nina Ellis. Filmmaker Catalina Alvarez interviewed Talon Silverhorn for her film Soundspring, which will have its Columbus, Ohio premiere in October 2024 at the Wexner Center for the Arts. Chris Welter interviewed Talon and Shelley Silverhorn at Hale Farm and Village, a historic property of the Western Reserve Historical Society in Summit County, Ohio. Thanks to the Ohio Botanical Conference of 2023 for permission to use audio of Talon's keynote address. Alejandro Figueroa interviewed Jeremy Turner at his farm near Indianapolis. The editor of The Ohio Country is Samantha Summer. The cultural advisor is Dr. John Bickers, assistant professor at Case Western University and a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. Flawn Williams is the audio mixer, and the composer is Evan Miller. Layla Troyer, a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, designed our logo. I'm the digital assets producer, Mary Evans. You can find photos and maps at wyso.org/podcast. This program is made possible through a partnership with Ohio Humanities, a nonprofit that shares stories to spark conversations and inspire ideas, and by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a More Perfect Union initiative. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Ohio Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities.
To see visual content related to the Ohio Country, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. And for a full transcript of every episode made by humans, go to wyso.org.